The prevailing narrative focuses on kinetic threats. Russia's campaign in Ukraine, which Zelensky notes has now outlasted Nazi Germany's war with the USSR, is presented as the primary blueprint for modern conflict. Media fixates on missiles, hypersonic platforms, and territorial control. This is a strategic misdirection. The solvency of the Western system is not threatened by a symmetric state-on-state launch. The true vector is silent. According to CSIS, over 95% of all global data and trillions in daily financial transactions travel through a network of approximately 550 undersea cables. This is the central nervous system of global liquidity. While officials warn Americans about physical threats from paramilitaries in states like Venezuela, the mathematical certainty of systemic collapse lies here. A coordinated, unattributable severing of key nodes, like the Atlantic crossing or cables in the Luzon Strait, is not an internet outage. It is a liquidity event, a solvency crisis executed with plausible deniability. The second vector is atmospheric. RUSI reports confirm the deployment of ground-based lasers and co-orbital anti-satellite systems designed for one purpose: to blind the adversary. Without GPS and ISR satellite constellations, the entire architecture of precision warfare and global command and control ceases to exist. The kinetic cost of finding and destroying these assets from the ground is prohibitive and escalatory. The asymmetric cost of blinding them from orbit or with ground-based directed energy weapons is minimal. This creates the ultimate liability: the blind Leviathan. A dominant power, deafened and blinded, its financial system frozen, and its global surveillance network dark. It cannot see the attacker. It cannot quantify the damage. Its only remaining protocol is a disproportionate kinetic response against a list of probable actors to erase a liability it cannot manage. This is not a failure of the system. It's a feature of its design. The launch on warning posture, created during the Cold War era of clear alliances, becomes a catastrophic accelerant when the enemy is silent and invisible. The kinetic event was not an act of strength. It was a solvency crisis. The war was not a choice. It was a balance sheet transaction, a desperate move to stave off internal default. CSIS analysis confirms the core domestic liability: the high probability of an unpopular war becoming a vector for internal collapse. The Kremlin faced a mathematical certainty: a slow, grinding dissolution driven by economic stagnation and demographic decay, or a high-risk external pivot. When a state is internally insolvent, it cannot afford symmetric warfare. The kinetic cost is too high. Weakness forces a mandatory pivot to asymmetry. You don't launch a war you cannot afford. You launch a war to make your opponent pay for your survival. The strategic objective was never total kinetic victory. It was to export the solvency crisis, to transform an internal, unmanageable liability into an external systemic liability for the dominant power bloc, forcing them into a launch-on-warning posture that guarantees overreaction and wider systemic destabilization. The economics of lethality have inverted. This is the core mechanism. The Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, documents the mathematical certainty of this new battlefield calculus. On one side, a $5 million main battle tank, a marvel of industrial-era power, requiring decades of R&D and a massive supply chain. On the other, a $500 first-person view drone, an off-the-shelf commercial product modified in a garage carrying a simple explosive charge. The math is not complex. For the cost of one tank, an adversary can field 10,000 of these kinetic liabilities. This isn't warfare, it's an audit of a failing business model. This is what analysts refer to as the democratization of violence. The systemic barrier to entry for projecting lethal force has collapsed. It no longer requires a nation-state's treasury or industrial base. It requires a credit card and an internet connection. The dominant power is now facing a solvency crisis. Its multi-million-dollar assets are being attrited by $1,000 threats. This creates an unsustainable economic bleed. The strategic response is not a choice, it's a protocol. To avoid catastrophic asset loss, the system must trigger a launch-on-warning posture, escalating kinetically to eliminate the cheap threat at its source. This is the overreaction the blueprint demands. The battlefield is no longer a fixed line on a map, it is a condition. According to official warnings, Americans in Venezuela are being hunted by paramilitaries. This is not random chaos, it is a blueprint. Your citizenship has been redesignated from an asset to a liability, and the zone of conflict is wherever they decide it is. This staging ground is what strategists call the gray zone. It's a space of plausible deniability where unconventional warfare becomes the primary vector. It is not limited to failed states. Recall the Cold War threats over Greenland. This was not about purchasing land, it was a kinetic cost calculation to control a strategic zone before an adversary could leverage it as a launch point. Dominant powers now see all territory, even that of allies, as potential liabilities. Within these zones, narrative is ammunition. When President Zelensky states Russia repeated fascism, as reported by the Kyiv Independent, this is not just rhetoric. It is a system-level attack on an opponent's legitimacy, designed to lock in alliances and unlock financial and military support. It transforms a regional conflict into a global moral imperative, making de-escalation a political impossibility. This protocol is not confined to foreign soil. The gray zone is expanding inward. When U.S. policy declares a war on Wall Street landlords, it signals the deployment of asymmetric economic tactics against a domestic target. This creates an internal solvency crisis, fracturing the system from within and draining resources that would otherwise be projected outward. It's a self-inflicted wound disguised as policy. This is the mechanism. An outmatched actor initiates a low-cost, high-impact event in a gray zone, like targeting civilians in Venezuela. The goal is not victory. It is to create an unsolvable liability. The dominant power is then forced into a launch-on-warning protocol, triggering a predictable, disproportionate kinetic overreaction. According to CSIS analysis, regions exhibiting extreme instability are viewed as proxy laboratories for refining these very tactics. The mathematical certainty is this: these gray zones will merge. The next vector will not distinguish between foreign and domestic, or between military and economic. It will be a systemic attack on liquidity itself, staged from a network of proxy states and non-state actors. The ultimate goal is not to defeat the dominant power on the battlefield, but to trigger its own protocols to liquidate itself. The launch-on-warning doctrine is not a strategy. It is a pre-programmed systemic response. Analysts at CSIS confirm it was engineered during the Cold War to solve a simple mathematical problem, ensuring a retaliatory strike could be launched before an incoming nuclear barrage destroys the capacity to respond. It is a protocol designed for a symmetric world of verifiable kinetic threats. That world is gone. The new vector of attack is not kinetic, it is digital. According to RUSI assessments, a targeted cyber attack can blind a nation's entire early warning apparatus, its satellites, its ground-based radar, its subsurface acoustic sensors. This action creates an immediate data vacuum, a condition termed the fog of digital war. The commander is now functionally blind. The critical question is no longer, are we under attack, but is the absence of data the attack itself? The launch-on-warning protocol creates an unsolvable liability. To wait for kinetic confirmation is to risk a decapitation strike and total systemic failure. To act on the digital ambiguity is to risk initiating global thermonuclear war based on a bluff. The asymmetric actor does not need to launch a missile. They only need to launch a question into the command system that the protocol cannot solve without a kinetic cost. The fear of a solvency crisis, the inability to answer an attack, forces the dominant power to erase the liability by triggering its own pre-authorized catastrophic response. This is the blueprint. The primary vector for systemic risk is no longer symmetric state power. It is the manufacturing of an unsolvable political liability. The blueprint is to engineer a public crisis that a dominant power cannot survive ignoring. CSS analysis confirms hostile actors now favor proxy forces, such as the paramilitaries officials warn are hunting U.S. citizens in Venezuela. This creates the ideal architecture for an attribution-impossible attack. The calibration shot. Within the next 12 months, anticipate a kinetic event targeting a subsea data cable landing station in the Caribbean. The attack will be low sophistication, but timed to coincide with the presence of American civilian engineers. It will be claimed by a previously unknown paramilitary group, making direct state attribution a political impossibility. The resulting data blackout and public outrage will present Washington with a solvency crisis of decision-making. Absorb a humiliating strategic blow, or launch a disproportionate kinetic reprisal against a ghost, initiating the systemic cascade.